Well, there was a small plane that held 4 people. It had a pilot, a pastor, and 2 teenagers. One of those teenagers had just won an award for being the smartest teenager in the world. And he was pretty excited about having won that award, and he let everyone know about it, that he had just gotten this award. Well, as they were flying, it turns out that the pilot turned around to the other 3 passengers and said, "Okay, I have some bad news and I have some worse news. The bad news is we're out of gas and the plane's going down. The worst news is I only have 3 parachutes. Now, I have a family and 3 kids, so I need one of them." He grabs one of the parachutes and jumps out of the plane. So the other 3 are sitting there. The smartest teenager in the world turns around and says, "You know what? I just won the award for being the smartest teenager in the world. I'm important. I might find the cure for cancer. You don't know what I can do. I need one." He grabs the bag and jumps out of the plane. The pastor turns to the other teenager and says, "You know what? I've made my peace with God. I know where I'm going after I die. I'm not afraid to die. You take the other parachute." And he's interrupted by the teenager who says, "You know what? Don't worry about it. The smartest teenager in the world just grabbed my backpack and jumped out of the plane." A little wisdom goes a long ways. Wisdom is greater than foolishness. But sometimes we act impulsively and we grab that backpack rather than the parachute. Sometimes we act impulsively and do foolish things. And other times we may even stop and think about what we're doing, and we know what we're choosing to do, but we still decide to do something foolish. Or maybe you know the right thing to do in a given situation, but when the circumstances change and you're in a different situation, but where the same principle would apply, you fail to apply that principle in that situation because it's different and you don't make the connection. Or when someone gives you some godly correction or some godly advice, are you willing to listen? And are you willing to wait on God and trust Him to do what He needs to do? Or do you rush in and step in and say, "Well, I've got this, I got to take care of it"? These are all things that require wisdom, and all things that we see alluded to in our text today. So in our passage today, we will see some wise behavior and we will see some foolish behavior. And we'll see that wisdom is greater than foolishness. So let's jump in chapter 25, beginning verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. There was a man in Moab whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite." And so the first thing we're told here this morning is that Samuel, the prophet, has died. And then we're told that David went down further south. It seems like these two ideas are linked together. And it may be that now that Samuel, the prophet, who was David's greatest supporter in Israel, has died, that David has moved further away from Saul. But we're just told that he's died and David has moved. But also in these verses, we're introduced to the main characters. There's David, there's Nabal, and Abigail. These are the 3 main characters of the passage of the story that we see today. Well, we already know David, but we're introduced to this guy named Nabal. And Nabal is a very wealthy businessman. And we're told that he has all these sheep and goats to prove the point that he is extremely wealthy. But we also know that Nabal is a great fool. His name is very fitting to him because his name actually means foolish. Now, it's possible that originally that wasn't the meaning of his name. You know, that his parent, I don't know many kids who have a baby and said, "What a cute baby, I'm going to name you Foolish." So it's very possible that there was another word that had the same spelling or maybe in the same sound that it was connected to, but you know, that both have the same sounds but have two different meanings or two different. Like in English, we could say that someone is a rank individual. And by that I could say that someone has great character and or high position, or it could mean that they are extremely stinky. Okay? So foolish, noble, foolish maybe, I don't know, but anyways, his name here means foolish. But we're told here in his description that he was very harsh, that he was a harsh man. In other words, he was mean. He was just not a nice guy. And that he was badly behaved. Or more literally, his actions were evil. Or his deeds were evil. And so this is Nabal. And this is how he is described. It's not a positive description. He's not a good guy. But then we're introduced to Abigail. She's the wife of Nabal, but obviously he clearly doesn't deserve her. Because she is beautiful, and we're told that she is discerning, or she's wise. That word literally good of insight. So she thinks well. It means that she has a good head on her shoulders. She was able to think very well. She was very insightful and understanding. But these words also imply a moral quality. And the point that is being made here is that Nabal has no moral discretion or religious understanding, but Abigail does. And then there's one other fact that we were given here in these opening verses. And it helps to set up the story. And it's that Nabal was working in Carmel shearing his sheep. So let's continue on then in verse 4. It says, David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus shall you greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." So David is sending these messengers to Nabal, and we don't really know what connection they have until we hear this discussion, and we find out the connection between them based on the dialogue that the message that the messengers are taking. And so what we find out is that they don't really know each other. David and Nabal don't really know each other, but David has been helpful to Nabal. The actions of David and his men have benefited Nabal in a great way. Now, they actually protected Nabal's sheep and goats and shepherds while they were out in the wilderness together. They were there in the same area, and they made sure that they were all taken care of. Now, the shepherds were probably down there for grazing. David and his men were hiding out there, and while they were together, they made sure that nothing happened to them, and they were all kept safe. Now, he uses this phrase, "We did them no harm." And his point there is just quite simply that they could have. They could have taken whatever they wanted, and it might even be expected, because that's what you would expect from just this band of marauders or this group of mercenaries that are out there in the wilderness. What are they going to do? Where are they going to get food? Well, they're just going to take it from their, like pirates, they're just to take whatever they want from whomever they want and however they want. But David makes the point, we didn't do that. We didn't harm them at all. It wouldn't have been unusual, but he didn't do it anyways. In fact, they did the opposite. They guarded them while they were in the wilderness. Now, Nabal during this time could have lost part or a lot of his investment. But because of David and his men, he lost nothing. And so David actually did a great benefit for Nabal. And because of that, David makes this request of Nabal. And his request, he's very polite and respectful. And he's basically asking that in return for all of the good that I did for you, that we did for you, can you give something to me and my men? So that's what he's asking. He's not asking for a huge payment. He's just saying, can you do whatever you have at hand? Just give something to my men. Now, there's a couple cultural things going on here that we need to understand that help us to understand what David's doing here. The first one is that it was very common after shearing. He said very clearly, I hear that you are shearing. After they sheared the sheep, that they would have a celebration feast, because it was kind of like coming to the end of the business season where you collect all your money. So it's like the work was done. Look, we have all these sheep, we sheared them, and now we get to sell it, and we're making money. And so because of that, you have a party. And so it's at this time that he sends them this request. They've just finished the season, and they've just made money, and they're having this party. The second thing is it's also very common after the shearing that the owner would reward a good shepherd, an effective shepherd. In other words, a shepherd who did his job very well and kept his sheep safe and alive. Because if you don't keep sheep safe and alive, you lose your investment. And so if you were a very good shepherd, you might receive a reward. It was kind of like a bonus, a performance bonus that was written into your contract. And so it's at this time that David says, look what we did. We were like effective shepherds. We have helped you keep your animals safe. And so it's at this time he sends this request, and he's basically just saying, can you give us our part of the reward? Can you help us out? We helped you. Can you help us out a little? Well, look what happens, verse 9. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't know where? So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So they take the message to Nabal and they wait for the answer. And what they get is not exactly what they had expected. They were hoping for reward, and what they got was insult. You see, Nabal here lives up to his description. He's rude, and he's arrogant, and he's disrespectful. He totally rejects David and David's request. He wants nothing to do with it. He actually kind of holds David in contempt here. And he says, the thing is, we have to realize, he knows who David is. And he knows about the situation with Saul. We get this from a couple of his comments that he makes. He knows who David is, and he knows about the situation with Saul, that David and Saul are kind of at odds. And he most likely also knows that David will be the future king. And I say that because later on in verse 30, we find out that his wife knows this. And so he knows about this, but he totally blows David off. He doesn't care. He acts like David is a nobody. He says, who's David? Who's the son of Jesse? Not only that, but he disrespects him and insults him and acts like he's just a bad servant or a rebellious servant who has just deserted his master. He's like, there's lots of servants who are leaving their masters nowadays. So he's like, he just insults David. He's like, you're just a rebel who's running away and being unfaithful to your master. But then as he continues to talk, we also see that Nabal is just purely selfish. He says, should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have for my workers. It's all about me. It's mine. It's mine. Why would I give anything to you? As if he has nothing to be grateful for. As if David has not done anything to benefit him. But see, what Nabal comes at it was this way. I have no association with David. I have no contract with David. We made no agreement. So basically he's saying, I didn't ask David to do anything for me, so I don't need to do anything for David. Why would I? Why would I show gratitude to this loser running around in the wilderness? Well, his answer is then reported back to David, and David quickly reacts. David is immediately ready to take vengeance on Nabal. And he feels justified in doing so. Because he says, I did good for him, but now he's mistreated me. He's insulted me in return. David deserved reward and gratitude, but instead he was insulted. And David takes offense to this. And he reacts quickly and severely. Nabal deserves to die. And not only that, but I'm ready to take care of it. I'm going to make it happen. And he tells everyone, get your swords. So they all strap on their swords. He calls them to arms and they're going to battle. Now this may only be implied here, but in case you want to know for sure what he is doing, jump down for a minute to verse 21 and 22. And David makes it very clear what he's about to do. Now David had said, surely in vain I have guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned to me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. David is going to kill every man associated with Nabal. So not only Nabal, but every man associated with Nabal. He says Nabal returned evil for good. Not just he treated me poorly, but he says he did evil. He did wrong. It was wicked what he did. Not just rude, but he returned that for good. And he's going to go kill all the men. Now, is David right here? Or is this just a knee-jerk reaction? I think so. Even if he could justify this, should he do it? So even if he can say, well, I know that he was wrong, and here is why, and I can do that, should he do it? Remember back in the last chapter, chapter 24, when Saul wandered into the cave that David and his men were in. And his men told David, hey, go, this is your opportunity. You can kill him. And we talked about that, how David could have justified several ways killing Saul. He could have had several different justifications for it, but what did David do? He refused, and he wouldn't let anyone else harm him. He said, I will not harm the Lord's anointed. And he said, this is not my place, it's God's place. So he knew that even though God had told him, you will be king, you will replace Saul as king, that he was to wait on God, and that God would take Saul out when it was the right time and the right way. And until then, he just had to wait on God. David understood that. And he refused to do anything against Saul. So in that situation, he recognized it wasn't his place, but it was God's. But now when we're talking about just an ordinary citizen, David doesn't get it. The same principle applies. Is it David's place to take vengeance, or is it God's? It's God's. But in this situation, David doesn't see it. And he's ready to take care of it himself and take things into his own hands. So in one circumstance he gets it, but in another, where the same principle applies, he doesn't get it. Thing is, we can be like David. Now, you thought that Nabal was going to be the only one doing something foolish in this passage, right? No, because David is there too. He's acting foolish as well. And we can fall into that same kind of foolishness. You see, we need to be careful that we live by godly principles in every part of our life, across the board, in every situation. You need to be careful that you don't justify sin in a particular situation because, it's okay here. And I'm not just talking about taking vengeance here. And the passage is specifically talking about vengeance here, but we can apply this to any principle, godly principle. What about lying? Okay, we know that lying is wrong. But in a given situation, can it be justified? Is it then okay? Is it good? I've heard many people do that, say that. But lying is always lying. Or say, I would never talk that way to this person. I would never be disrespectful. But this person, he's not as important. It doesn't matter. He's not my boss. It doesn't matter. I would never steal. But is that handful of pins that you've got in your car from the office? Think through how these principles apply. And apply it from one situation to the next situation. If the same principle applies, apply it. You get the picture. To be consistent at applying godly wisdom and godly principles to different situations. Well, at this point in our story, the scene cuts away from David in order to show what's happening at Nabal's house while David is getting the news and then grabbing their swords. Look at verse 14. It says, but one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. You see, Abigail doesn't know what has happened. And so now the messenger, or one of the young men, probably one of their shepherds, goes to Abigail and says, you wouldn't believe what just happened. David sent messengers, and Nabal, he yelled at them or screamed at them. He railed at them. He did not treat them well. Verse 15, yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. David had said to Nabal, you can ask your men what happened. And here we have that testimony. He says they were very good to us. They treated us very well, and we didn't lose anything because of them. Verse 16, they were a wall to us, both by night and by day, and while we were with them, keeping the sheep. So he says, when we were with them, we didn't have to worry about a thing. They were a wall. They were like a fortress around us. So not only did they not hurt us, but they didn't let anyone else or anything else hurt us as well. Verse 17, now therefore, know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house. And he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. He says to Abigail, now you need to think about this. Is there something you can do, or what should you do? Because he just knows that harm is coming. He knows that David is coming. And he says, and we can't talk to Nabal. He doesn't listen to anyone. He says, one ear in one ear, out the other. We may say something, but he won't listen. Verse 18, then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me, before I come. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And so she gets all this food together, all these things together, and she puts them on donkeys and she sends her servants ahead. This reminds me of Jacob and Esau. Remember when Jacob was outside the land, and when he came back into the land of Israel and he was going to meet Esau, he knew Esau was coming. What did he do? He got this big gift, big present ready for Esau. And he sent that on up ahead. And the people, they took those animals, and then he had his family, and then Jacob was last. Why? Because so he could butter up Esau before he got to him. And so by the time he got to Jacob, Esau would be kind of, his defenses would be down, and he wouldn't be after and want to kill him. And so she does the same thing. Take this to him, and I'm coming right behind you. And then we're told that she didn't tell her husband, which makes sense because he probably would have said no. He probably would have stopped her from doing it. So she just does it on her own and doesn't consult him. She just makes sure to make it happen. Verse 20, and as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came toward her, and she met them. So David was coming up to attack. She came down to protect. Verse 21. Now David had said, surely in vain. Oh, I read that. So let's jump down to verse 23. Then Abigail saw David. She hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. So she's going to speak with David, and she's going to tell him all this stuff. Verse 25. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for he, as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now in this passage, there's going to be the word Lord a whole bunch of times. If it's lowercase, she's talking about David. If it's capital, she's talking about God. All right? Just think, because it can be confusing. Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken, certainly you and has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel. My Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. Whew. That was a long speech, and there was a lot of words in there. So let me just kind of break that down. There's several things she says, and she's giving the reason. She's going to reason with him about what he should do and why he should do it. So the first thing, she meets him, and she immediately bows down before David and shows him this deep respect. It's the same thing that David did for Saul when he went out of the cave behind him. He called Saul and he bowed down to the ground, showing him respect. Well, she does the same thing. And she asked David not to harm her family, not to harm them. But how does she make that request? She starts off by saying, let me stand in the place of everyone else. Let me take all the guilt. In other words, if you have something against Nabal or anybody in our household, then let me take the blame for it. Now, she's probably assuming that David isn't going to immediately strike down a woman, and especially with the big gift that she had just brought. But she says, let me stand in their place. And she does this. She is standing there in the place, doing whatever she can to save her household. And so she offers herself up, but then she asks him to listen to her. And she gives him this reasoned explanation of what he should do and why he should do it. So first of all, she says several things. First of all, she asks him not to hold the actions of Nabal against them. Why? Because he's a fool. He says, he's just foolish. He does these things. Please don't hold his actions against him and against the rest of us. And she continues that she didn't know about the messengers. So all that happened, it happened without her knowledge. Secondly, she offers him the gift. Thirdly, she asks him to forgive the sin that was committed against him. Fourthly, she then makes a case for why he should forgive them. And there's a couple parts to this. First of all, she reminds him that God is supporting and protecting David, and that David will be made king. She says, once you become the prince of Israel, God is going to make you king. The second part of that reason is that she tells him that he doesn't want to have innocent blood on his hands. And not only does she not want innocent blood on his hands, but he especially doesn't want it because he's going to be king. And he says that would not be befitting for the future king. So not only would it be wrong and you'd be guilty of this great sin, but also it's not fitting for a future king to enter into his reign with blood guilt on his hands for killing innocent people. She says, you don't want to have to deal with that. You don't want that. You want to have a clear conscience. And in doing so, you need to let God take care of things rather than taking care of it yourself. Working salvation for yourself is the way she puts it. She says, you need to let God take care of that because that's his job. But if you take things into your own hands and overstep and sin, that won't be good. And the fifth thing she says is then she sees that her meeting with David on that road to stop him from making this mistake is actually God's providence. And she asks David to remember her when he becomes king. In other words, what she's saying is, don't forget how God used you to help me. Used me to help you, and treat me well when you become king. Well, how does David respond to her request and to her words of wisdom? Look at verse 32. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. So he recognizes that what he was about to do was wrong, that he was about to make a huge mistake, and she stopped him from it. But first and foremost, the credit goes to God, because God sent her. He sent her to stop him from sinning and to keep his hands clean. And David praises her for her wisdom, and he accepts her gift and sends her home in peace. Says, you don't need to worry about anything. So David is not going to harm them. You see, wisdom is a good thing. We see wisdom throughout this passage in a couple of different ways. First of all, we saw the servant who went to Abigail, and he had the insight to notice what happened and tell Abigail, look what's going to happen. You need to do something about this. And then Abigail went and spoke godly wisdom to David and stopped him from sinning. God used them both to keep his servant David from doing something terribly wrong. And so when you know God's truth and you are able to apply that to life, then you have godly wisdom. And when you have godly wisdom, God can use you to help his people to do the right thing. In fact, as believers, as followers of Jesus, we are actually called to do that, to use godly wisdom to help others in their growth, in their becoming more like Christ. Colossians 3:16 says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thanksgiving in your heart to God. We are supposed to help each other grow in our walk with God. We use the wisdom that God has given us to help another. And on the other side of that thing, if another believer comes and wisely and respectfully points out some sin in your life or some sin that you are about to do, listen to them. Consider what they have to say, because you don't want to be a fool. And Proverbs 1:7 says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. You don't want to be that fool, but you want to be wise. You want to follow closely after Christ. So let's speak godly wisdom to each other. And when you're told or spoken to, let's listen to the godly wisdom, consider it, and take it to heart. Well, there's just a little bit left in our story. We need to find out what happened when Abigail got home. Look at verses 36 through 44. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you to him as his wife." And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was in Galim. So when Abigail gets back home, Nabal is too drunk to hear anything, so she waits till he's sober. So the next day she talks to him and she tells him what she did when he's sober, and he has some physical reaction to it, like a heart attack or a stroke or something. We don't know exactly what happened, but it says that his heart died within him. But of course it wasn't for 10 days till he died, but his heart, something happened to him. He had a heart attack, stroke, something. Now, this may have been because he was upset because he realized, oh man, I was just about killed and I didn't know it. But more likely, it was probably something like, "Why did you give my stuff to David?" But he had this reaction and he died. But ultimately, whatever the reason, we see ultimately it was because God was judging him for his sin, for the wrong he had done. And 10 days later, he died. Well, David realizes that God has avenged him and praises God for keeping him from doing it himself, from taking those things into his own hands instead of waiting on God. And then we're told that he married Abigail, and of course we might question the wisdom of polygamy, but he takes Abigail as a wife, and we're told about some other wives that he takes, but it's not surprising that he would take Abigail because she is wise and beautiful. But he takes these wives. But we need to remember that God is the perfect, sovereign, and just judge. And vengeance is his responsibility, not ours. In fact, Paul writes in Romans 12, verses 17 and 19, "Repay no evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." What Paul's telling us here is that we need to wait on God. And we need to leave things in God's hands because he'll take care of it. Now, it may not be as quick and severe or decisive or as obvious as it was here in the case of Nabal. In fact, you may not even realize that God's doing something. But God's ways and God's timing are perfect. And if something is only God's responsibility, that means it's not yours. So let God do God's job. But for all of these things that we talked about today, we need wisdom. Godly wisdom. But how do we get it? How do we get godly wisdom? Well, the simple answer is this. Spend time with God. Spend time with God. How do you get more like someone? You hang out with them. How do you learn what someone else knows? If you have a mentor, you hang out with them. You spend time with God. Read His Word. Pray. Worship. Spend time with Him. Be with other godly people who have godly wisdom. And you will learn godly wisdom. Now I have one other answer, and that's the answer that James gives us, which is very direct. He says in James 1:5, he says, if any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. What he's saying is if you need wisdom, ask God, and God gives. He loves to give people wisdom. And he says He gives generously and without reproach, meaning He's not going to make fun of you. Ha! You're so dumb, you need more wisdom. God doesn't do that. He says, I love that you want wisdom. Let me give you some wisdom. So when we spend time with Him and we ask Him for wisdom, He gives wisdom. Proverbs 2 verses 6 to 8 says, for the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the ways of His saints. You see, God's wisdom will keep you from being foolish and making bad choices. So you need wisdom? Spend time with God and ask Him. And He will give it to you. Because just like you don't want to jump out of an airplane with a backpack on your back, we don't want to go through life without God's wisdom.